into action. We'll begin with how the climate crisis is reshaping the future of transport in Latin America and the Caribbean. I'd like to give the floor to my boss, Graham Watkins, Climate Change Division Chief within the IDB, to make the opening remarks. Graham, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to try and be as rapid as possible because I know everybody keeps running from one event to another event. I'm Graham Watkins. I'm the head of climate at the Inter-American Development Bank. This is the second time I've spoken about this publication and this work, and I just wanted to emphasize how happy I am about this work and how important I think it is. I mean, I think this is is the first really comprehensive study that tries to look at what's happening in transport systems across Latin America and the Caribbean. That's particularly important from our perspective because it's regional, focused on the region, and it covers the majority of the transport systems. And it looks at the state of play, it looks at the challenges, and probably more importantly, looks at the opportunities, the future directions that we can go in. And it sets up sort of roadmaps for urban mobility, for road transport, for maritime transport, and for the aviation sector. So it's pretty comprehensive in terms of what it covers. I want to say thank you to the groups that have been involved in the development of this. So the International Transport Forum, I'm reading it because I want to make sure I don't mistake anybody. The International Association of Public Transport, the International Road Federation, the International Association of Ports and Harbors, and the Airports Council International for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think one of the jobs that we have as the climate division within the Inter-American Development Bank is to really work closely with our colleagues who really do all the work at the end of the day. We just try to help as much as possible to move the agenda forward. And actually, we're lucky enough to have both energy and transport sitting right here with us today, who have always historically been the sort of the core areas of action. To them, you add then water and sanitation as another sector that's moving forward. And obviously for Latin America and the Caribbean, agriculture and land use is key. And then one of the things about those groups is we've been working with them for quite a long time. And now we're adding in extensively capital markets, fiscal management, institutions, innovation, and obviously the social sectors as well, as we think through this as we move forward. So I think if you look at energy, energy is already rolling. If you haven't seen it yet, there's a nice article in the Telegraph that came out on December 5th, which has the graphs of the growth of energy. But it also has a secondary graph, which is the growth of electric vehicles. And that's also super impressive in terms of the agenda moving forward. So on that note, very positive note, welcome to everybody, and I'll hand over to Anna Maria.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Graham. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And I would like to start by saying that at the bank, oh, sorry, I have my clicker here. Yeah, at the bank, we have a great commitment to help the transport sector work towards a trajectory for decarbonization. And the importance of us being here, that is, as Graham said, like a joint collaboration of a sector that, for me at least, and I think we'll be discussing it with our colleagues in the World Bank, we need to be more involved in the discussion about climate change. Why? Well, at least in Latin America and the Caribbean, I will show you why. Because we, of course, are part of the problem, but more important, we're part of the solution. And by saying this, I would like to highlight that something that is very important for us in the transport community, but sometimes it's important to emphasize the role that transport plays on creating sustainable and inclusive societies. It's not an option, it's a need. It's a way of getting more opportunities for disadvantaged communities, for giving accessibility, and of course for our economies. And why I emphasize this? Because there's a discussion about, shall we stop transport, shall we stop moving, or it's something that we really need to do in order to grow and develop as sustainable societies. But we acknowledge that in the transport sector, we have a double challenge. We have a service that at the moment doesn't meet the needs of our population in the way that we would like to, is still have a huge infrastructure gap in Latin America and the Caribbean, and a huge gap on providing better services. And at the same time, we account for 40% of the total CO2 emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean. So we're saying this is how we do keep expanding and providing a better service and a better infrastructure at the same time that we reduce and help the sector decarbonize the sector and work towards reducing the emissions. And by saying this, what our study says, and we will share some of the information about the study and the publication, is that if we carry on as we are now, our emissions will keep growing, and it could increase by 70% by 2050. And according to the agreements and the Paris alignment goals, which will be reducing them by half by 2050. So what can we do in order to work towards this path and reduce the emissions? And it's not just how the emissions are growing as well. What's happening is that Latin America and the Caribbean are one of the regions that are being more affected by the climate change effects. And that's something that we live in now. Our analysis in this publication that we will share with you said that our airports, road network, and the whole infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean, with some areas that are heavily affected now, will keep this track and will have the infrastructure in a critical conditions if we don't work towards a very strong adaptation agenda. So it's no news, it's the whole event is about how we can take action in order to work towards this. So in our report, we highlight the importance of taking real steps for the next 2 years on revising these trends and helping the countries to take really important areas focusing on 4 actions. First, prioritizing decarbonization and resilience. There is a still lack of presence of the decarbonization agenda on transport policy. So how we can help countries and governments to join this agenda, develop appropriate policy instruments in order to undertake these actions, adapt our transport institutions in order to have a climate agenda that really are technically and policy adapted to these challenges, and working with the private sector as a key ally on this strategy. We highlight a route of short, medium, and long-term strategies to work towards these goals. And I'm not going to go into the details, but we are proposing actions in these 4 areas. Of course, promoting sustainable mobility, reducing the carbon footprint of transportation, strengthening system resilience, and investing in innovation technology. These are in a holistic approach that really puts transportation and enables the environment for this to happen. This is the publication that Graham was introducing and that we've been working together with many of these institutions here present. And without more details, I would like to welcome our panelists to have a discussion about this important issue. So please come to I will invite to come to the stage Marta Caldas, the Environmental Affairs Coordinator of the Ministry of Transport in Colombia. Michael Russell, Senior VP International Relations at the Airport Council International. Philip Turner, Head of Sustainable Development, International Association of Public Transport. And Marcelino Madrigal, Energy Division Chief of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you everyone for being here and making this time on your busy agendas to be with us for this important discussion. So I would like by welcome you and start with Michael, that we've been having very important conversation before we started the panel about. You could tell us a little bit more. I mean, we're talking about all the sectors here, the publication cover all the sectors of transport that are very different. So could you please tell us about how ICAO set international goals for decarbonization, the aviation sector, and how does the region start toward achieving these goals?
Thank you very much. There we go. Good. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. This is a very interesting conversation. It's one that we will need to take forward very quickly and very seriously, and particularly in Latin America, Caribbean, because there is a lot of potential here. So that's the preface to this discussion. So let me just sort of say a little bit about where ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, is with this, and talk then a little bit about what the Latin American Caribbean region needs to do. So in September last year, ICAO and the member states agreed to a net zero goal by 2050, and that means that all sectors, all parts of aviation would be involved in decarbonization, but there would not be a specific number allocated to each state. So the idea is that the whole of the aviation sector would work together to reduce carbon emissions. 2 weeks ago in Dubai, we held a meeting hosted by ICAO that worked on an interim target of 5% improvement in carbon efficiency by 2030, and recognized that the development of sustainable aviation fuel was going to be absolutely key to meeting that objective. The work that goes on from there is going to be the further analysis of how we're going to get to that target. Now, it's important to note that Latin American and Caribbean states are not required to have a 5% target themselves. This is a global target, but we will discuss, and I would like to have more of a conversation on this, that it is really important that the region does, in fact, take the initiative and develop programs. And this is why the IDB is so important, is because it can help make that aspiration a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, and for that suggestion of how we can move the sustainable aviation fuel agenda in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I would like to turn now to Philip. Philip, how do you see Latin America and the Caribbean in comparison to other developing regions in the world regarding public transportation?
Okay. Well, first of all,
and achieving the goals. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Over the course of the year, I've had the pleasure to review all the NDCs that have been submitted. It's a labour of love, I can tell you. And looking at which countries have identified public transport interventions within that. I think generally the quality really varies. You've got some very specific kind of NDCs detailing what countries are going to be doing on public transport, or others are extremely vague. They just say, we're going to expand or improve public transport. I have no idea what that means. I would say that there is generally a north-south divide, with Global North focusing on improved technologies, Global South looking more about infrastructure investments around public transport. But I would say Latin America and the Caribbean has actually the most public transport interventions within it. Around 68, 70% include public transport. And it's actually very unlike some of the other regions, because it really focuses on cleaner vehicles, but also complemented by service enhancements. The link with renewable energy is made. I think it's the only region that really does that. Costa Rica, for instance, has that. But it also includes land use planning, behavior change means, I believe Uruguay quite clearly articulates that. So I would say it's the region with the most comprehensive avoid, shift, improve approaches. But again, very vague in certain areas. No mode shift targets. It's one of the only regions with no mode shift targets in the NDCs. And the largest countries, they're just really focusing on private vehicles, not looking at reducing kilometers. And so I think there's room for improvement.
A lot, and precisely as we say in the publication, there is a lot of space of developing regulatory and policy frameworks for the transport sector for decarbonization, and that's why I would like to pass to Marta. Marta, could you tell us about how Colombia has set up transportation goals to reduce emissions by 2030? And we're going to switch to Spanish, so I will try to summarize for the public that doesn't speak English at the end, but please go ahead.
Thank you, Ana María. En primer lugar, quiero agradecer.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to take part in this panel. In Colombia, we are firmly committed to meeting our NDC goals, and it is for that reason that we have proposed a series of strategies that will allow us to achieve our goals. First of which includes a strategy that we implemented last year, the National Active Mobility Strategy. Through this strategy, the idea is to generate a series of activities and tasks that the national government and subnational governments can undertake to ensure better infrastructure for pedestrians and cyclists in all our cities, and more importantly, that attaches a gender and a differentiated focus. Another strategy that we have is that we're thinking about modernizing our fleets. In Colombia, we have 18 million vehicles, most of which have an average age of 20 years. So through a technical cooperation that we had with the Inter-American Development Bank, we've been structuring a technology access fund that will allow vehicle owners to access some benefits and financing to be able to modernize their vehicles.
Marta was sharing how they have specific actions and goals set up for the transport decarbonization. One of the strategies that they developing is active mobility. And another one that they working very committed on the fleet renewal strategy and how they can help. Now Colombia has 18, did you say 18 mil?
18 millones.
18 million of vehicles for more than 20 years of life, which of course they committed to renew those fleets, and they having a very special program, structuring a fund for renewal of that fleet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now let's pass to Marcelino. Marcelino, the energy sector is key enable to transport decarbonization. Is the sector in lag ready for this transition or for this enabling?
Yes, thank you, Ana Maria, and thank you to all the panelists for the invitation. I think the relationship between the energy and transport systems, I will call it that way, is mutually beneficial. And I would say we are ready, and with the proper adaptations, we will always be ready with the proper adaptations. So there are three angles in which I think this relationship is happening. Of course, we provide the electricity for electric mobility, and today all the consumption of electricity for e-vehicles is only like 0.5% of the world consumption. 0.5 seems like a little, but it's equivalent to the energy that Argentina consumes. So suddenly, in the last 10 years, a similar amount of the electricity Argentina consumes is being consumed in the world for electric vehicles. But that's globally, right? When we go locally, our systems are ready to manage the current level of penetration in Latin America. As soon as you increase penetration of electric vehicles, our grids will have to be adapted, especially with electric bus stations, because those really require some additions to the city grids. It's nothing that utilities cannot manage as long as there is communication between the sectors, because the load of an EV charging bus depot is similar to the load of this building or a bigger building. So you really need to plan for it gradually. And in the long term, because demand for electricity will triple, there is really a mutual benefit, because even though demand for electricity will grow, if we do smart charging, the investment needs of the system as a whole will go down. So that is one mutual one benefit going to the transport sector. The other, and as we have seen in Latin America, the energy companies are becoming providers of transport services, especially provision of fleet. It's power utilities in Latin America, the ones who are providing the technology and the buses to transport operators. A beautiful synergy on how energy companies are going into providing this type of services, including, of course, the energy and the technical expertise. Why is that? Because of the technological expertise of power companies working with electricity. So I think that has been a very fruitful relationship that is working now this way, right? And then the last one, because there is a bigger energy benefit that we need to look into this, into the numbers. Although electricity demand will grow, consumption for oil will go down dramatically. Today, the electric vehicles that are already circulating in the world have avoided consuming more than 1 million barrels per day, daily. That's a lot. That's equivalent to the exports of many countries in Latin America. So that also tells you the other side of the picture. Countries that do not have oil will save oil, and that's good for the system as a whole, because even though you increase consumption of electricity, you will reduce consumption of oil. Overall consumption goes down dramatically, and this is why emissions go down dramatically, especially in Latin America, where we have a very clean electricity grid in many of our countries. So I just see a very good relationship, and with the proper adaptations, I think the region is up to this challenge. Yeah.
Thank you, Marcelino. Very, very interesting. And I would like to go back to Marta and Philip and talk about urban mobility a little bit more. And where do you think our cities and countries need to invest to make more significant progress needed by 2030 to help work or achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and how, with the things that have been discussed in this COP, how do you see that? And Philip, let's start by you.
Okay. Well, I could take the easy option and just say, well, invest in your public transport networks. But that's a little bit too easy. So I'm going to put it in the context of this COP that 2025 NDCs need to be updated. And really kind of this COP kicks off that process. So I would actually urge countries to invest in having good NDCs, because essentially they're a political commitment. They can access the finance needed to invest in public transport systems, and they can help connect across ministries and provide that priority and send strong signals to markets. So I think it's critically important that NDCs are updated, and they're updated well. I think 6 things that really need to be done include those range of efforts. So invest in improving public transport infrastructure, services, cleaner vehicles, look at behavioural change policies, look at land use policies, but critically important, include governance reforms. Establishing a public transport authority that manages mobility is critical. It works. Targets. Include mode share targets as well as clean vehicle targets. It is the most cost-effective way to reduce urban emissions. If you double public transport usage, it will reduce urban emissions by 50% by 2030. There's significant potential there. I think one of the important lessons is also set out how you're going to work with cities. NDCs really don't explain how they're going to enable the local level. 20% of policy levers are actually at the local level are determined by national governments. So they can really enable their cities to improve their public transport networks. the easiest way, this is just the easiest way to improve ambition, is include the plans that are happening at the local level. In the Latin American region, they don't include any of them. I think the closest to Chile, where they have the targets for clean electric buses, but they're not really explaining how cities are going to be delivering against them. I think it's just a really easy way. Fifth, capacity building. Countries really need capacity building technical assistance. They're really asking for it. I think IDB can play a critical role with some of the partners like UITP in really facilitating that, because it delivers better results for citizens, but also better policies as well. And I think lastly, include KPIs on how these policies are going to improve not just emissions, but also urban mobility, and report that up to the national level, because then you can see the impact of policies, and it really does enable that multi-level governance, which is a critical issue here for discussion at this COP. So those would be my 6 recommendations.
Thank you. Very, very important and specific, given that, as you say, in the transport sector, there are lots of policy levels at the national level, but lots of the solutions means local solutions. And that's what Marta could maybe tell us about. How is that happening in Colombia? What are you achieving in order to improve urban mobility towards these alignments and the goals?
Gracias. Coincido mucho con lo que ya se mencionó. Y
Thanks. I very much agree with what has been said. And one thing that is quite remarkable is that we need to create knowledge. We need to educate and train people as to what the energy transition is, and also to convey that this is not a thing of the future. It is now. So all of the measures we may implement now should raise collective awareness in this regard. Now, specifically onto the measures we're implementing, they're about promoting active mobility, helping people proceed with this modal change to reduce the number of journeys within our cities, also designing sustainable city models. We can't go on envisaging expanding cities. Rather, we need to start building our cities upwards in order to have shorter journeys. While at the same time, there's the need to invest in technology for low and zero emission vehicles, preferably e-vehicles, and we should also develop recharging infrastructure, which is very important. In our country, we don't currently have sufficient infrastructure to carry out the energy transition. We therefore need to make a huge investment as a country in such developments. And it's not just development for the transport sector, but generally to meet our NDCs. There are studies that point to the fact that if we want to meet our 2050 goals, we would have to quintuple the energy capacity we currently have in the country. So we are talking about generating a whole set of measures, not just as an individual sector, but as the Colombian government. That would be a summary.
Active mobility, better infrastructure for charging,
Hay un problema.
on public and transportation infrastructure in order to make it more viable. Now, Michael, looking at the air sector and from what you've seen here at the COP, what are the most compelling action needed to get on track on these low emission trajectories in this sector, particularly for developing countries such as the ones in our region?
Thank you very much. So this is a helpful sort of introduction because several speakers have picked up some of these elements. This question about a regulatory framework is absolutely key. And it's a framework which will come from the international organizations. So it will come from the COP, it will come from ICAO, and you mentioned it actually in your introductory remarks, the importance of having a very clear regulatory framework for investors to be able to decide what they need to do next. So what we also know is that from the aviation sector, that the demand for energy is going to be intense. The first movers are going to be looking at sustainable aviation fuel. This is going to replace your fossil fuels. It's not going to happen overnight. And we talked about this before, is that it's so important that the multinational development banks are able to stimulate the development of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, in the first place, sustainable aviation fuel is going to come from the used cooking oils, the tallow, the fats, under what they describe as the HEFA process. There's also increasing opportunity, increasing technology for development then of alcohol to jet. And really, you know, Latin America is very, very well placed for that, because you need cellulose, you make your alcohol, you turn that into jet fuel. So we picked up, didn't we, on this question about the developing countries and the capacity building. All of that is part of this process. But then the next step is going to be what's described as power to liquid. And that means harnessing power, whether it is solar, whether it's wind, whether it's nuclear power. You said we're going to need more electricity. We're going to need at least twice as much electricity as you think we do. If we are to genuinely decarbonize the transport sector, and aviation is recognized as being a very hard to abate sector, along with trucking, along with shipping, if we're going to truly decarbonize that, then we've got to be looking at this question about power to liquid, which is where we're going to be using electricity to make hydrogen. Preferably, we're going to be capturing carbon from the air, so that we're actually having a net reduction. And then we're going to be able to use that to make sustainable aviation fuel. So I say your ambitions on hydrogen, ambitions on electricity, we need a lot. So stepwise, so regulatory framework, first, de-risking, second, and then making it an attractive environment for the private sector to invest is the third point to this. And that's why it's so important that we have these sorts of conversations where we bring everybody together and we are able to say, look, you know, this is what we need, this is the framework, this is the seed corn, the catalyst that is needed. And then here are the private sector who are prepared to put up the bulk of that investment to make sure that these things can happen. So the last thing that I would say is that, yes, there are uncertainties, but a lot of the way that this needs to move forward is through learning by doing, by understanding what others have done before, where can we repurpose what we've already got, and then move forward and say, just do it. And get it done so that we can start getting sustainable aviation fuel into the market. You'll get acceptance, and then you will get more. So it's a really important sort of iterative process, but there have to be first movers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And the last question for Marcelino. Marcelino, from the energy perspective, and what with you seen today in this discussion and in our report, how can NDBs help fostering this energy transition in the transport sector?
You know, I'm afraid of being repetitive with Michael, because I agree a lot with him. And if I reflect on what we have done together at the IDB with our transport colleagues with climate change, from the energy perspective, I think what really is changing the way people perceive electricity is when we work in the knowledge part and the regulation. I mean, how power utilities are going to consider charging infrastructure. Is it a service? Is it selling electricity? And the region has already sort of passed that stage. But developing the regulations to understand what is that new consumer was really a roadblock for a few years in Latin America. Now, I think we're understanding what that is, because it's not really a traditional sale of electricity, it's more like a service. And those roadblocks in the regulatory part were really creating issues. They were avoiding, you know, private investment to flow into charging infrastructure. And just little changes in regulation can make investment flourish in certain segments like charging infrastructure. That is one. We will need to produce more electricity and more fuels. I think that we still have a lot of knowledge and technology barriers that we need to tackle. There is also a need to do a lot of pre-investment, and we have seen in our discussion in electric buses, the power utility has its questions of where they are going to charge. The bus operators has its questions, or if the duration of the battery is enough. So doing all that pre-investment on how to electrify and how to put together the power utilities and the transport operators is critical. And you put them together through pre-investment activities, analyzing per se the projects. And I think we still need to do that. And of course, the financing that we traditionally do, that, as everybody knows, we have financed, EV charging infrastructure, fleets, hundreds of electric buses in the region. So I think we need to keep doing on that, and focusing also in new fuels like transportation for air industry.
Thank you, Marcelino. And I would like to just highlight some of the points that were made by you today. And the first thing is that we have a very complex sector. That's no news for those that come from the sector, but it's important to explain that when we talk about decarbonization of the transport sector, we're talking so many different actors and subsectors that take into account lots of policy actions and interventions in order to real has a transformation of the sector. That path for having the data. We didn't talk about data today, but it's important to acknowledge each country and what are the challenges of each country regarding decarbonization. There are countries in Latin America that don't want to have the discussion about decarbonization of the transport sector because they believe that that's not a priority because that sector in that country is not the main contributing to the mission. So how do we help all the countries to have a real discussion on what's happening worldwide and how that applies to each of the countries and how the actions have to be taken now in order to avoid those 70% increase for 2050. So I think we have advanced on the conversation of how the transport sector contributes to decarbonization. A couple of years ago, we wouldn't even having these conversations. We have it now. Now we need to help countries to have the data, have specific plans on the NDCs and having a specific transport decarbonization plan in each country that respond to the needs of each country, but as well that contributes to the big agenda. Colombia is example of Colombia, Chile, Costa Rica. There are many good examples in the region of how we're doing it. But as well, and I want to emphasize the importance of resilience and how we adapt the infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean to respond to what we're facing at the moment. Our report talks a lot about that. And I think from the bank, we have as well a role on helping making more resilient infrastructure. And in order to do that, how we help these communities and cities, and I think that I take that for the discussion, how we kind of help bridge the gap between national policy and what's happening in our cities, and how we solving the eternal discussion about how do we finance public transport infrastructure and services. Think for the energy transition, for electromobility, everything starts with the business model and how we're going to pay for this. And I feel that until we don't solve the financial sustainability of the transport sector, urban public transport sector, we're not going to be able to enable the whole long-term transition if we want. So thank you so much. We're going to have now a video that the Ministry of Colombia wants to show us about how they implemented the fleet renewal program. And with this, I finish, I think, on time.
Colombia is a country with 50 million inhabitants, in which more than 70% of the population lives in urban areas. Our main cities present traffic congestion problems due to the high number of vehicles that travel at a very low speed. The transport sector in Colombia has an important and strategic role in the national territory, being a sector that has a high negative environmental impact and at the same time is one of the sectors that boost the economy, development, and social growth. Therefore, an indispensable sector in national daily life in supporting the population. The fleet of road transport vehicles is made up of more than 18.3 million vehicles, where 61% are motorcycles, 35% are light vehicles, and 4% correspond to heavy vehicles. The latter category being the oldest operation of the entire fleet, exceeding 30 years of age in some categories such as dump trucks. On average, the national fleet is 19 years old, generating an alert regarding the need to update the vehicle fleet to respond to current environmental and energy consumption requirements. 98% of the Colombian vehicle fleet depends mostly on fossil fuels for its operation. 45% gasoline, 40% diesel, 10% jet fuel, 3% natural gas. We are the sector that consumes the most energy at the demand level, with 42% energy consumption on transportation compared to 26% on average worldwide. Additionally, due to the conditions such as the age of the fleet, technological availability, operational inefficiency, absence of vehicle renewal schemes, only 30% of our available energy is used. Currently, the transport sector is the third national greenhouse gas emitter according to the biennial unit report, our most recent GHG inventory in Colombia, emitting 37.8 million tons of CO2 equivalent. It is estimated that by 2030, it will exceed 50 million tons of CO2 equivalent. And if this continues, by 2050, it will exceed 100 million tons of CO2 equivalent. This is why in Colombia, we must accelerate the fair energy transition in the transport sector. And our main commitment in this government is the creation of a technological advancement fund, which will be the mechanism through which the current owners of trucks, buses, and taxis who do not have the resources to modernize their vehicles will be able to access the financial support that will allow them to acquire low and zero emission fleets. What are the fund's objectives? Reduce the CAPEX differential with respect to conventional technologies. Reduce the total cost of ownership with respect to conventional technologies. Give access and offer soft loans to vehicle owners. Offer technical assistance, institutional coordination mechanisms, and business structures. With the Technological Advancement Fund fully operational, we expect that between 2024 and 2030, there will be a renewal of 122,000 taxis, more than 3,000 trucks, and more than 4,000 buses, for a total of almost 130,000 vehicles. This commitment will allow a reduction in accumulated emissions by 2030 of 9.4 million tons of carbon dioxide. To achieve this, it has been estimated that a total of $8.8 billion are required, of which 3.3 billion, equivalent to 37%, will come from contributions of our nation's general budget, funding through our own mechanisms of each segment, among others. On the other hand, resources from international cooperation amount to $5.6 billion, equivalent to 63% of funding needs.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope we can continue this discussion. Thank you. Thank you for coming.